undisclosed location somewhere in the northern hemisphere, waiting out the alien apocalypse. He is armed with a machete and a microphone. This is the Mysterious Outpost.
Welcome to Mysterious Outpost Radio. This is your host, Mike. Tonight on the show, I got Nick Redfern. You can go to his website, nickredfern410.blogspot.com. I'll get the link to his website, and his books in the description below. Check them out for yourself. Let me know your thoughts in the comments. You know, I like to read your comments. I actually do take time to read the comments. I just may not reply to all the comments. But Nick Redfern, he is a true patriot when it comes to the paranormal, when it comes to mysteries, when it comes to mysterious things. Hence this show, Mysterious Outpost. He pretty much brings a good vibe, the perfect researcher, one of the top researchers I like to have come on to the show, because this is exactly the show I like to base it around. Mysterious Outpost Radio. And welcome to the show, Nick. How are you doing?
Hey, Mike. I'm doing good, thanks. How's it going?
Within this hour, I'm going to kind of pick your brain like George Norrie. I'm going to ask you some $1 million questions within about an hour. Okay. Are you up for it?
All right.
But
that works.
But Shapeshifters, Morphing Monsters and Changing Cryptids. I'm telling you, I bought this book on Amazon Kindle. I'm still going to get the paperback because I'm a paperback guy, but I needed it really quick because I kind of procrastinated and didn't get it in time through just the hardback copy. But what led you down the road, down the path to write this book about shapeshifters?
Well, whenever I'm working on a new book, Mike, I always try and put myself in the position of the readers, because as well as being a writer, I'm also a reader as well. Mm-hmm. So I think it's always important to come up with new ideas and concepts and theories. And my two main areas of research are UFOs and cryptozoology. Cryptozoology being the study of unknown animals like Bigfoot, lake monsters, chupacabra, etc., Mothman, things like that. And it's always kind of a bit of a challenge to come up with a new idea for a book, because you don't want to go over old ground and just repeat what somebody else has said time and time again, because there's no point. So I always think carefully about what am I going to do the next book on. And one of the things sort of going through a lot of the files that I've got, which I sort of realized I hadn't touched upon, was these cases of shape-shifting. Now, when people think of shape-shifting, most people think of werewolves, and typical images from Hollywood movies, where somebody changes into a werewolf at a full moon and kills a bunch of kids in the woods, like on some of these, bad movies on certain channels we all know about. And
I love those B movies, though.
Yeah, some of them are good. It depends. There's like good bad, and there's just bad as well, though.
Mm-hmm.
But so one of the things I found, that going through a lot of my old files and new ones as well, was that I got a lot of cases that fell broadly into the category of shape-shifting, but which took it far and wide away from just werewolves. I didn't just want to do a werewolf book. There's so many of them as well. But I found, or I should say, I'd got a lot of reports of shapeshifters in relation to UFOs, to cryptozoology, even to things like the Men in Black and reptilians. So I thought, well, why not try and do a shapeshifters book that's a little bit different to the average shapeshifter book, where we're not just talking about silver bullets and werewolves and full moons. We're actually looking at multiple different types of shapeshifters in a wide range of aspects of the paranormal.
And you cover many topics within this book as well. I'm just going to go through a couple of the chapters. Of course, the werewolves of the past. You talk about shape-shifting at the cemetery, the black cat phenomenon, Bigfoot, mysterious apes, aliens that probably aren't. I really like that chapter. And the most dangerous shapeshifters of all. And another one that I'm going to bring up here after a while, to have you explain a little bit more in detail, is the Men in Black and Black-Eyed Children. Always a fascinating topic. But out of all these chapters, which I think you have 20 chapters here or more, but out of all these chapters, which one of these topics is, I guess, more of your favorite to write about or talk about or investigate?
Well, I do talk about the Men in Black in the book, and that's sort of one of my favorite topics to write about. I've done 3 books on Men in Black and one on women in black, and there are a few weird shape-shifting stories in relation to the MIB. But one of the issues that sort of fascinated me when I was doing the research, which a lot of people don't know anything about it at all, is what I call, it's kind of like a subcategory of shape-shifting, but where these creatures actually don't physically shift, but they mimic the forms of other animals or creatures. I'll explain what I mean by that. There are a number of cases where people have been in the woods, either hunting or just out on a day out, taking a stroll, whatever, and they suddenly hear like the cry of what sounds like a baby, like a newborn human baby in distress, and that's what it literally sounds like. And obviously, like most people, you think, well, wow, somebody's dumped a baby in the woods, so you go and try and find it, and get it to a hospital or whatever. Mm-hmm. And the more people get into the woods, they still hear this baby crying, but it's always, far away, or still far enough away at least to where they have to keep getting further and further in, and more denser into the woods. And then suddenly, as they get closer and closer, they hear this sort of deep growl and see this shadowy figure, as if these Bigfoot-type creatures are actually not shape-shifting, but sort of mimicking people. Not shape-shifting into people, kind of backwards to the werewolf, but kind of almost like voice-shifting rather than shape-shifting. And I've got a lot of really weird and creepy stories like this where Bigfoot creatures have mimicked the cries of babies, and one of the big theories is they do it to try and lure us deep into the woods, and then who knows for what reason, maybe we're the next dinner, maybe that's what happens to all the people who go missing every year in the forests of the United States. So that's like a really creepy one, the idea that Bigfoot could sort of not so much shape shift, but voice shift itself to take on sort of the guise, if you like, of a baby, or the noise of a baby, as a means to sort of, as I said, lure us deep into the woods. So that's sort of a pretty sinister angle of Bigfoot, really.
Are there any cases that, I guess, are pretty much homicide by ape? Has there been any deaths that have been notified or noted somewhere, I don't know, rather recorded history or pre-recorded history, that maybe possibly just legends of these Bigfoot or apes killing people?
Well, actually, there's like a really weird but also interesting book, and it's also a very historical book. It was actually written by none other than the U.S. President Theodore Roosevelt, and we're talking about more than 100 years ago now. And the President Roosevelt, he was an avid hunter. And he talked about in one of his books regarding how on one occasion he'd run across this particular hunter deep in the woods who told him this story about how this guy had been hunting in the woods with a colleague and friend of his. And they got this weird feeling that they were being watched and followed. And at one point, they split up. And when the one guy, his name was Bowman, got back to the camp, he found his friend, his body was like trampled on and bones were broken, his neck was broken, and there were sort of savage tears to the skin. And it looked like something heavy and large had, sort of trampled all over it, stamped on him, and just thrown him around the campsite. Now, in one sense, you could sort of make the analogy, well, was this something like a grizzly bear? But the interesting thing was that Bowman told the president that the prints they looked like human prints. There were 2 of them. They clearly weren't the tracks of a bear, which has claws. They weren't anything like a mountain lion. They looked like very human feet. or prints, I should say, but much longer. Now, of course, the term Bigfoot didn't exist 100 years ago or so, so there was no way to make a 100% comparison. But if you read the president's book, he actually talks about how, they were talking about this bipedal creature with huge feet roaming around and following them, and then one of his friends getting essentially slaughtered by this creature and savagely, the corpse was kind of just, battered and bruised. So, there are a few cases like that where people have been reportedly murdered or people have gone missing, never to be seen again in the direct vicinity where Bigfoot creatures were seen. And that is really kind of the more sinister side of Bigfoot that a lot of researchers don't want to delve into. The idea that perhaps they even use us as food, maybe not deliberately and regularly, but like any animal, if it's winter time, they're starving, they'll go after whatever's out there,
So is it possible that maybe some kind of rogue element out there are using things like Bigfoot, shapeshifters, or whatever, using them as some type of advanced technology, maybe for some kind of advanced weaponry either for now, or they're experimenting on it for the future?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of weird theories when it comes to Bigfoot and, shape-shifting. One of the things I talk about, interestingly enough, is, something that relates to Texas, which is where I live. If you go down just outside the city of Houston, where it starts to border on Louisiana, there's a very large area of forest land called the Big Thicket, gigantic area. A lot of people outside of Texas, I've come to know, think Texas is just desert and cactus. It actually isn't, though. I mean, East Texas is massively forested, particularly so, as I said, the further you get closer to Louisiana. But not too far from the city of Houston, you've got this gigantic area of forest land called the Big Thicket. Now, the Big Thicket has a long road that runs a dusty, not really that good for driving along, but a long dusty road that runs through the Big Thicket called Bragg Road. But the local people in the area, they either refer to it as Ghost Light Road or Ghost Road, depending on which ones you ask. And the reason why they call it that is because people have seen these weird balls of light flitting through the woods, anywhere from the size of like a tennis ball to around like a beach ball. And they seem to exhibit intelligence. If people move towards them or away, they react to the presence of the person. Now, there's some really weird stories where people claim to have seen these balls of light sort of shapeshift or morph into a Bigfoot, or they've seen the Bigfoot morph into a ball of light, as if possibly these Bigfoot, maybe their original form is like some sort of intelligent ball of energy, which has the ability to take on multiple different forms, one of them being the Bigfoot. Now, of course, this is really at the more controversial alternative end of
that's where I like to go. That's the roads I like to go down, Nick.
Yeah, the idea that Bigfoot could be a shapeshifter, and one that has the ability to sort of alter its form, because its original form may well be sort of like pure energy. And energy can't be destroyed, but it can be manipulated and altered. So the idea that Bigfoot could be a shapeshifter, is a very alternative one that most cryptozoologists have no time for. But as I said, the fact is there are more than a few stories like that from the Big Thicket area, and I think we have to treat these stories seriously.
And you talk about the energy aspects of Bigfoot or just shapeshifters in general, and maybe they're one and the same, or maybe what I'm about to ask you, maybe it's just maybe they're classified all together. But one reason why maybe Bigfoot or just shapeshifters in general, it's hard to gather enough hard evidence, like solid proof as evidence, is because the notion of possibly being interdimensional. Have you come across anything to prove or maybe to speculate that they could be possibly interdimensional?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of cases like that where people have seen Bigfoot-type creatures, and they have sort of either vanished in a flash of light, or they've literally sort of winked out of existence, as if 1 second they're in our reality, and then the next second they're gone back to whatever reality they come from. Now, this might explain why we get a lot of rumors about governments and military agencies secretly researching the Bigfoot phenomenon. Now, I don't think they would be secretly investigating Bigfoot if it was just a North American equivalent of, say, an African gorilla. There'd be no point, and there'd be no reason to hide that. But if they suspect, as I suspect they do, if these agencies are of the opinion or believe that Bigfoot is not just a shapeshifter, but can jump from multiple dimensions, then there could be a great deal of military gain if we could understand how to jump dimensions and, instantaneously move from one location to another via sort of portals, wormholes, different dimensions. That would be something the military would really be interested in, because it would be, if you imagine we went to war in the Middle East with somebody, and you could instantaneously go from being in, say, Washington, D.C. to the heart of Baghdad, that kind of situation in seconds. So I would not be at all surprised if a lot of these stories about conspiracies and the government watching Bigfoot and investigating it, I wouldn't be at all surprised if it's because, not so much because they care per se of what these things are, they want to try and figure out the technology that allows Bigfoot and these similar creatures to flit in and out of our reality. And if they can, do exactly the same, that really would be a major sort of military goal and, to be followed.
And have you seen it's mostly a Netflix movie. You may be able to find it certain other sources as well. Have you seen the movie Spectral?
I don't think I've seen that one, no.
It's a newer movie, but please, you have to watch that movie. I will read you the plot before I go into it off of Wikipedia. DARPA researcher Dr. Mark Klein is flown to Moldova, where the U.S. military is currently deployed in the ongoing Moldovan war, as his expertise is required regarding a line of hyperspectral imaging goggles of his design that have been issued to the troops there. After arriving at the U.S. military air base on the outskirts of, I'm not going to try to say this name, he meets with General Orland and CIA officer Fran Madison. He has shown footage. I'm not giving to any spoilers, people that haven't really watched it. This pretty much on the trailer. But he has shown footage captured by the troops, goggles of mysterious, translucent humanoid apparitions that kills almost instantly. And that's all I'm going to go. They are fighting, basically, like you can watch this on the trailer. So I'm not really, spoiler alert, maybe just tune this part out. But basically, these troops are fighting pretty much like a shapeshifters. They call them mysterious, translucent humanoid apparitions. And I'm not going to give the spoiler of what these apparitions actually are. You just have to watch it for yourself. But it's like a World War III scenario where these humanoid apparitions are actually a product of experimentation. That's why I brought that up a while ago, Nick.
Oh, okay.
And
you said it's called Spectral.
Spectral. It's a Spectral. Very good movie. Like, if you're a sci-fi guru like me, you'll enjoy it.
Oh, cool.
But anyways, do all shapeshifters, okay, maybe asking you to speculate some, but do they all come from the same source of origin? Like, where do you think they come from? Like we mentioned about interdimensional. Or is it from some other source out there? Or are they possibly just a product here on Earth?
Well, that's a good question, because, one of the things is that there's a tendency, because some of these things look different, balls of light, a Bigfoot, a werewolf, you name it, a man in black, they all, obviously, at first glance, seem to be completely different and completely unconnected. But, if we take the view that these shapeshifters, because they can shift their shape, then maybe they're actually all part of the same thing. In other words, if somebody sees a Bigfoot, somebody sees a werewolf, somebody sees a weird ball of light, somebody sees a black dog. It's possible, I think, that they could actually all be the same thing, but taking on multiple different forms. So in other words, there might be one kind of archetypal form that they are, is their natural existence, their natural form of existence. But for whatever reasons, they may choose to take on multiple different forms, which makes it look like they all have different origins, but they may not have. It could all be one particular phenomenon. So I think that's an important thing to note. But then again, you could also make the case that they're all completely unconnected and all sort of chaotically running around in our environment, doing whatever they're doing, and having no connection to each other. So, or maybe it's somewhere in between. The problem is we're sort of pretty much still speculating as to what these things are, how they're able to sort of shift their energy and take on multiple different forms, and can we ever duplicate it? So there's a lot of sort of questions still to be answered, and I think things like shapeshifters, it's not surprising because you're dealing with such a bizarre, weird phenomenon that most people won't touch because, like I said, they think it's just like something out of a Hollywood slasher movie or whatever.
Now, before we get a little bit, we're about almost halfway into the interview, but before we get further, are you a subscriber to David Icke's theory with the reptilian shapeshifters?
Well, whenever I get asked that question, and I do get asked it a lot, I say yes and no, and I'll explain what I mean by that. It's not a case of fence sitting, but what I would say, I'm not convinced that the British royal family are shape-shifting lizards or reptiles. I'm just not. I'm not a fan of the royal family, so it's not a case of me defending them. I'm not really a fan because I think the concept of a royal family, it's outdated because we have a prime minister who is like the equivalent of a president. So the royal family are just really for tourists, more than anything else. So, but I don't think the royal family are reptilians. But in saying that, I've got a large number of reports of people who have sworn they have seen reptilian-type creatures shape-shift into people and vice versa. Or they've just seen, the creature as a shapeshifter and it hasn't changed its shape, but it's still one of these particular things. I mean, I've got a lot of reports of people who've been abducted. Now, when you think of alien abduction, people think of like the little grey creatures with the big heads and the black eyes, etc., kidnapping people and performing all sorts of weird experiments on them. But there are a lot of cases where people have seen or been in the proximity of aliens, the little ones, or taken on board craft, and they've seen reptilians in the room where the experimentation's going on. I've got a few stories where people saw the reptilians themselves sort of morph into the greys, and the greys morph into the reptilians. And I've got a lot of cases where people have talked about being taken to sort of underground military installations where they saw like military guys in kind of like black SWAT type outfits almost, and in the background just sort of kind of standing silently in the against the walls just watching were these sort of 7 to 8 foot tall reptile type creatures. So in other words, I do think there is a genuine reptilian phenomenon. And I've spoken to people who come across totally normal, but just totally in fear of the fact they saw like a person kind of shimmer and change into a reptile type thing and back again. And in some cases, the creatures were hostile because they realized somebody had been able to see what was going on, where for whatever reason, most of us don't see it happening. But again, as I said, I'm not convinced the royals are reptiles, but I do think there's a genuine reptilian phenomenon. Yeah.
Have you seen the classic 1980s? I think it was 87 or 88 movie They Live. Have you seen that movie?
Is that the one where
it's got the wrestler
goggles, sunglasses?
Yes, that's it.
Yeah, I have seen it, but I probably haven't seen it for probably 20 years. But I do remember it. Yeah, where where they kind of look like burn victims or something, the aliens.
But watching, like I said, I'm a big sci-fi guru. Yeah, you have your good sci-fi movies and you have your horrible sci-fi movies, but I still seem to watch them, even though I'm like a big critic.
Yeah, that's a good one. I remember that. That was a good one. Yeah.
I actually have the poster in my room right now, but when
cool.
every time I watch that movie, They Live, you know, it makes me think of, especially because you've talked about Shapeshifters before. You know, you just never really went in detail like with this book.
Yeah.
But what if, I know this is a big what if, but what if these shapeshifters are possibly extraterrestrial spirits that possess human host like they did in They Live?
Well, I mean, there are a lot of cases where people have sort of felt either mind controlled by aliens, or in some cases, you know, they've actually sort of have been possessed. I mean, one of the interesting and like really alternative theories for the Men in Black is that like an alien host will essentially possess them. So in other words, the theory is that the reason why these Men in Black act so weird and creepy is because they're essentially possessed, you know, by some sort of non-human mind, or briefly at least. And then when it leaves the mind of the person, they're like, what the hell just happened for the last 4 hours? You know, that kind of thing. So there are a few interesting cases like this, you know, where the shifting is more not physical, but, you know, in the mind. And of course, obviously the most visible example would be something like demonic possession, which, you know, would be, it's not a physical transformation, but, you know, there are a lot of really creepy stories of people who, you know, their mind has been sort of enslaved, or, you know, just literally that the mind of something else has taken over the person.
Kind of like a mind parasite.
Yeah, it's not literal shape shifting, but it's sort of a mind shift, you know, where the person's original or the person's own mind sort of gets placed in limbo, and the mind of the entity takes over, really. So,
do you write about? Because I didn't get to read the book through and through, but I read at least probably half of it on the Kindle version. But do you write about shapeshifters? Of course, you know, we're putting a big umbrella over a lot of the mysterious phenomena, but are shapeshifters demonic in origin?
Well, I mean, whenever I get that question asked about demonic things, I think the important thing is, you know, how do we define something that is demonic? Now,
fair.
When you use the word demonic, it obviously conjures up images of sort of hell and demons, the devil and horns and forked tails, etc. I try not to use too much, you know, words like demonic, not so because I have any problem with using them, but it does sort of unconsciously in the mind of the reader immediately put one particular image in their mind. So I think, you know, for one person's sort of demonic entity is somebody else's supernatural entity that, you know, the demon lives in hell, but the supernatural entity lives in a different dimension, you know, but it's kind of pretty much the same thing. It just depends how, you know, do you call it a different dimension or do you call it hell? You know, or do you call it another dimension, or do you call it heaven, you know, or purgatory, or what different religions? You know, they all have different names, but it all boils down to what we talk about today, sort of different realms of existence, different dimensions. So I think, you know, you can call these things demonic because in many cases they are hostile and dangerous, and, you know, they screw around with the human race and, you know, torture us and torment us and manipulate us purely and simply, I think, because they have get a warped pleasure out of it almost. Now, as I said, whether they're demons or science can explain their existence, you know, as multi-dimensional entities that can enter our world and we can possibly enter theirs, maybe in like a soul-like state, and that might sort of...
Maybe that's what the ghost sightings or apparitions, maybe that's what they really actually are, just... they're just entering this plane of dimension, but we put a label on them, you know, such as possibly shapeshifters, but what do you think about, I don't know, ghosts or these apparitions that people see all over the world? Do you think it's one and the same thing or something different?
Well, I think it's like a lot of these phenomena. I think the ghost phenomenon, which I've not really dug too deeply into ghosts that much, but I think, what I would say is that, I think the whole issue of ghosts isn't sort of explainable with just one thing. I think, we could be legitimately talking about something coming back in an afterlife form. And I actually do think personally, I have to admit, I'm not a big religious person, but I do believe there's an afterlife. I actually have had a couple of weird experiences. Ironically, one not with a person who passed away, but with one of my old pet dogs, Charity, and she died in 2003. And I actually had a couple of really weird experiences immediately after she died, the few days afterwards. So I do think something survives physical death. What it, the soul, life force, whatever you want to call it. But I don't sort of buy into the idea of, pearly gates and a old guy, with a beard and a long flowing gown, any more than I believe in like a guy with horns and a forked tail and et cetera, et cetera. I think that's sort of more of like a legend, folklore type situation created thousands of years ago to try and understand these different realms of existence, which I think the ancients knew about, and they tried in their own way to understand what they were. People talk, you look in ancient religious texts, you find stories of different realms of existence. And we're doing that today with like quantum physics. We're looking into the realms of theoretical multiple dimensions. So I think, ghosts, yes, there could be an afterlife angle to them. Maybe some sort of residual energy gets left behind when someone dies. And so, the image of the person remains for a few days or weeks. And you often get that where somebody dies and there's the sense that the presence is still there for a few days or a week and then it goes. So, maybe it's like a residual energy of the person stays behind, which may not be sort of intelligent and self-aware. It just may be, it's kind of like you burn the toast in the morning, the toast, the smell lingers. But some of them could actually be legitimate, like the soul still surviving. I think also possibly, this angle where people sometimes die violently and they leave sort of a powerful emotional imprint where, again, it's not necessarily a real person, but it's almost like an old style VHS tape, just playing over and over again or something, like on a loop. So I think there could be multiple explanations for ghosts in the same way there could be for shapeshifters. I think it's often our tendency, we try and pigeonhole all these things into one category when there could be multiple categories, really.
So in chapter 16 of your book, Shapeshifters, the title Men in Black and Black-Eyed Children. Where does this, like I mentioned earlier, I was going to save it for towards the end, but where does this tie in with the shapeshifter phenomena?
Well, again, this is where we go down some sort of really alternative avenues, if you like. And one of the reasons why I was pleased to do the book was because I was able to sort of bring a lot of new stuff to the table, which I thought people would find interesting rather than old ground.
It was very interesting.
Thanks. And I've got one case in the book where a woman had an experience with two black-eyed children, like the classic situation in all the black-eyed children cases where there was a loud knock on the door late at night, and the first thing you think, well, who on earth is that at this time of night? So he looked through the spy hole, and she looked through and saw these two kids dressed in black hoodies, very pale-skinned. She could see that, because there was illumination outside, but they were looking down at the ground and not showing the faces too well. She could see the chin and cheeks, but couldn't see the eyes and face too much because the hoodie was pulled down. And one of them said, can we come in? We're hungry. And can we use the telephone? There was all these different ruses they used to try and get invited into the home, which is kind of like a lot of the old legends of vampires, how they have to be invited in. And she got this really strange vibe from them. And then suddenly there was like this heat haze. You're driving down the highway, you see a heat haze and the car in front looks hazy, or the highway looks all blurry just through the heat. Mm-hmm. And it was kind of like that imagery. And they suddenly morphed into literally like 7 to 8 foot tall reptilians. So that kind of ties in with what you're talking about earlier. She saw these 2 black-eyed kids literally change into huge reptilian type creatures of the type that everybody knows about. Now, I have to admit, that's the only case I've got of the black-eyed children shape-shifting. But I spoke to the person, actually in person, the woman, and she did not come across as, crazy. She wasn't looking for any sort of anything in return. She just wanted to share the story and asked, can you give me any advice or any answers? And we had a good chat about it. And but it's interesting that the black-eyed children phenomenon is clearly parallels in many respects the Men in Black stories. Both wear black. They try and find a way into the house. They knock on the door. It's always late at night, etc., etc. And I've got one story in the book which is equally as bizarre as the black-eyed children one, where a witness saw a man in black on the doorstep, and it suddenly morphed into like a huge hound, like the Hound of the Baskervilles, with these fiery red eyes, and it just shot down the driveway. And, cases like that, they're so bizarre and alternative and rogue almost, it's difficult to categorize them because, the movies portray the Men in Black as government agents, but if you read most of the witness reports, they're clearly talking about something paranormal. They look pale and skinny, have these oversized eyes, and they can control people's minds. But you don't find many reports of them shape-shifting. Now, there are a few, but this one was probably more than any other, was one that really stood out, was this issue of this, turning into the closest thing you could think of to, like the Hound of the Baskervilles, this from the Sherlock Holmes stories. And again, the witness, I always try and, where possible, to interview the witnesses personally, and, came across very lucid, down to earth, but just, worried, frightened, and baffled by, what they'd seen. So, a lot of these things at first glance, just seem to be independent entities, but the more you dig into it, you find a lot of things tied to the shapeshifter phenomenon that you would never really think could ever be connected, really.
And is that what, going to the Men in Black just a little bit, is that what the Men in Black are basically used for? Because I've heard 2 sides of the story. That, of course, they're a government agency, or they're a government agency that go out there and investigate UFO sightings, UFO reports, and crash saucers and alien witness testimonies and things like that. Or, on the other side of the coin, are they actually some type of paranormal, paranormal enforcing agency? That's the best term I can use. Some type of paranormal enforcing agent that is not of this earth, or maybe part of another dimension, to keep these shapeshifters, these mysterious phenomena all over the world, to keep them in check, to keep them in line, because they are not actually a part of our plane of existence.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's a good point, because there's no doubt that there is 2 sides to the Men in Black. And there are, as bizarre as it sounds, there are actually at least 2 groups of Men in Black. Now, as I said, the vast majority of the reports are of these creepy, really pale, anemic-looking MIB, and the women in black look just the same as well. And they're usually very skinny and often quite tall, sort of 6'5" thereabouts. Have these bulging eyes. They can mind control people, and sometimes people have said they've fallen sick in their proximity. It's almost like they've been supernaturally infected. Now, that's the vast majority of the reports. And those were the original reports from the 50s and 60s onwards. But then later in the 60s, people started to associate the Men in Black with government agents. And I think what happened, and there's good evidence for this, is that agencies of government realized that there was this strange phenomenon of the Men in Black. and they knew it was nothing to do with them. They knew it was nothing to do with the government, that it was something really weird and paranormal. But they decided or thought, well, if we want to silence UFO witnesses, why don't we go out and dress up like those legendary guys, the Men in Black? So in other words, you had people in the intelligence community who, when there's an important UFO case and somebody needs to be silenced or threatened, it's a case of, okay, guys, get the fedora hats out and the suits and, put the fear of God into John Smith or whatever. But they aren't the real Men in Black. They used the Men in Black motif as a cover to cover their activities. And I think the government itself doesn't even really know what the real Men in Black are, other than that they are something paranormal. So that's why it gets really confusing that you've got two categories of Men in Black. You've got the original weird ones, and you've got the government saying, well, we can use this as camouflage, even though we don't know what they are. We can dress like them, and people will think it's the Men in Black. It's just us wearing black to, frighten the witnesses. So I think that's why there is this sort of distinct difference between some reports where some witnesses do get like an ID card flashed, and they're clearly government agents saying, just don't talk about this. We don't want you to talk about this anymore, etc., etc. But then you have these much stranger ones that kind of, like a gothic vampire from some 19th century old novel or whatever. And it's that particular group that, we associate with the Shapeshifters and all the other stuff. So, when you start talking about this group of Men in Black and that group of Men in Black, then it does start to get a bit confusing, even for me sometimes.
But let's skip forward just a little bit with our little time left, Nick. But first off, my wife, what makes me want to bring this up, because when I was looking through your chapters when you was just speaking, is my wife loves owls. She's fascinated by owls. She has owls all over the house. Good Lord. I hope she's not I hope she doesn't listen to this show. But anyways, give me a brief rundown of Chapter 18, The Eerie Owl Phenomenon.
Well, yeah, this is a weird one because this relates to the alien abduction phenomenon. There are a lot of cases where people, particularly in their cars or in bedrooms, so they've been driving down, dark, shadowy, forested road or whatever late at night, and they've seen this owl at the edge of the road. And instead of being a normal owl, it sort of stood upright, but it's like 5 feet tall, which is impossible. But people say, they saw these like 5 foot tall owls. But the weird thing is, they saw it and then they just carried on driving and said to themselves, oh, that was like a 5 foot tall owl, and didn't think anything about it until like hours later. And then they're like, why on earth didn't I stop the car? Because nobody sees a 5 foot tall owl, standing by the side of the road. But it's almost like their logic and their common sense factors had been briefly controlled, so they didn't think anything strange. Now, afterwards, they started to get, bad dreams of alien abduction experiences. So the one theory is that they were given like a screen memory of a large owl, when in actual fact it was like an alien grey. So in other words, it's a way of preventing, massive trauma is by creating a cover story. And that happens, that psychologically, that happens in a lot of situations. Say, for example, an unfortunate situation like a woman gets raped, and then afterwards, the trauma blocks out certain aspects of the experience because it is so traumatic. Same when people see a car accident, really grisly one, a week later they can't remember all they saw because the mind subconsciously blocks it out. And that's one of the theories, that perhaps the aliens, whatever the greys are, they can actually engineer that, deliberately do it by making people think they saw a giant owl when actually it was an abduction. But in saying that, there are some people who've said they've seen the greys morph into the form of a large owl, which makes me wonder if, they're sort of shape-shifting into the forms of owls as a means to sort of get close to us, and we won't think too much of it. There are a lot of cases of abductees waking up in the middle of the night and seeing an owl staring at them from outside the bedroom window, just intently staring at them. And although it was like, wow, that's wild, they didn't think anything more of it. But if you look at it from that other context, you could suggest that, they literally morphed into the form, shapeshifted into the form of an owl, but, from their original form of the greys. So, you got a lot of weird stuff like that, in relation to owls, and UFO encounters and alien abductions, and so many really, really, really weird stories that fall into that category.
And you mentioned 5-foot owls, people witnessing these owls as being taller in stature. So the first thing that popped in my head when you said that, Nick, of course, Mothman, because there's a little bit of similarity there. What do you think?
Well, yeah, and that again, that's one of the, I don't want to call it a problem, but one of the issues is you do get these crossovers. We have these giant owls, like obviously a giant bird, which is not unlike Mothman. Now, I actually talk about Mothman in the book as well because, when the sightings of Mothman began in late 1966 and came to a head in December 67, which is, coming up to its 50th anniversary in 2 months, when the town of Point Pleasant, where all the Mothman sightings were occurring, in December 67, the town's Silver Bridge collapsed into the Ohio River in December 67, killing 46 people. They just drowned in the cars when they just, the bridge collapsed and the cars just plummeted into the river and they drowned. Now, in the roughly just over a year-long period when people were seeing Mothman, people didn't actually describe the same thing. Some people did describe it as like a giant bird-type creature. A few said it was bizarrely more like a pterodactyl-type animal. And some of them swore they saw what was just like a flying humanoid. In other words, a very human-looking creature, but with large wings, kind of like the monster in the Jeepers Creepers movie. Mm-hmm. And now, it's difficult to sort of mistake a flying humanoid. You'd be startled enough to see it, but you probably wouldn't mistake a flying humanoid for a large bird because there's no, other than the wings, they're very different. So I talk about Mothman in the book from the context that people were describing they were all describing a flying creature, but there were a lot of very extreme differences between what people were seeing. So maybe Mothman itself, is tied in with these owl sightings, and there's a shapeshifter component there as well with Mothman.
So for the final question, what, with your chapter... Let me see here. The chapter 12, the fairies and the little people. What exactly are we? Because that's one chapter I didn't really go into in the book. Yeah. So give me a rundown of that chapter.
All right. Well, it's important to know. When people talk about fairies today, people think of Tinkerbell and kids' cartoon movies, that kind of thing. Sort of like a little female creature with wings and flitting around the Christmas tree. That's the image that people have of fairies today. If you go back sort of 500 or 600 years ago, in the old sort of European Middle Ages era tales of fairies, they were nothing like that. They were sort of 3 to 4 foot tall, creepy-looking dwarfish creatures that would come out at night, and they would live in old mounds, old mounds, and in tunnels and caves underground. They would steal babies. They would entrance people and hypnotize them, and they could be friendly or malicious, and they kind of looked like sort of almost like creepy old men, little 3 foot tall old men, like kind of like a creepy goblin type creature. Nothing like the Christmas card image people have today, but there are a lot of stories about fairy shape shifting. And one of the more interesting angles of this is that the fairies could supposedly turn themselves into like a large ball of light, not unlike the Bigfoot creatures, which is kind of an intriguing parallel. Other people claim to have seen them turn into like bats and foxes and creatures like that. Now, whether they literally shapeshifted or, as I think is possible in some cases, they projected an image that the person saw, almost like possibly a hologram, or, they altered the person's mind to see what they wanted them to see. But it may not have been the creature that shapeshifted. It may have been the image that the person was seeing shapeshifted. In other words, like a hologram kind of situation. But yeah, you can find a lot of stories like that in the original ancient stories of fairies, which I said are nothing like, the modern day image. It was actually a really good film. I'm not a big fan of Kevin Costner, but there's a really good film he made, and not a very well-known film, made about 10 years ago, called The New Daughter. And that's a really good one because it deals with these sort of creepy, dangerous creatures that live in the woods deep underground that have become relegated to the worlds of like fables and legends, but they're sort of like an ancient type of small primitive humanoid. So to get a chance to watch that, the new Daughter, that would give you an idea of what the original fairies were like. But it doesn't have the shapeshifter angle in there. But the shapeshifter angle of the fairy stories is very prevalent throughout a lot of cultures.
Well, Nick, I really appreciate your time this time. There's so many other questions that I have, but I want to have you on in the near future to discuss more things, some more of your books. And I tell you one thing, if I could label you as something, I don't know if you would like it, but I would say the paranormal rock star, because
well, that's not a bad one.
because
I've been called much worse over the years.
The paranormal rock star, because I'm telling you, you're spitting these books out left and right, Shapeshifters and many others about UFOs, just the paranormal in general, ancient mysteries, the occult, and you do a fantastic job in doing your sources in these books, searching for stories, because a lot of your books, you actually find stories, true actual stories that actually happened, and you label it very well, and you talk about these things in your books very well, and that's why I gave you the label the paranormal rock star.
Oh, well, thanks. I mean, it's one of these things where a lot of my books, could not be written without the witnesses, so I'm always really thankful to the witnesses for, being willing to share their stories, because without the witnesses, we've got nothing to go on. So, I find that the more books I write, the more people give you feedback. And so, that does help a lot.
Is it tough to try to find these stories?
Sometimes, the historical reports you can find just by doing, just regular research. But, a lot of the stories, like, for example, the shape-shifting black-eyed children into reptilians and the black dog and the men in black, those stories were just given to me directly. In one case, when I met the witness at a conference, actually, the Mothman Festival, ironically. And other times, people will say, they've been listening to a radio show like yours, and they send me a Facebook message and say, hey, Nick, listening to Mike's show, heard you talking about shape-shifting reptilians, here's a story for you. That happens a lot. So more recent cases, that they typically come through to me from the witnesses themselves.
That's awesome. But Nick, thank you for your time this evening, and I will have you back on soon, and I really appreciate it.
All right, thanks a lot, Mike.
And that is Nick Redfern. Go to his website, nickredfern410.blogspot.com. Check out his research, support his research, check out his new book. I've almost 2/3 through the book, Shapeshifters, Morphing Monsters and Changing Cryptids. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. We have more interviews coming soon. And until next time, keep truthing and have a good one.